Chapter 14 of Pioneer Work in the Alps of New Zealand by Arthur Paul Harper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Chapter 14. Landsborough River. Into Landsborough Valley. New Year's Day. No birds. Starvation rations. A forced march. Haast Pass track. Return up river. Broderick's Pass. Back at Christmas Flat. It is always best to camp if possible near some scrub, in case of bad weather, for it would be very wretched to be without a fire for 2 or 3 days. From the Karangarua saddle, it seemed that 4 hours good travelling would be necessary before the first scrub was reached, which meant about 7 hours from Christmas Flat. Accordingly, on the morning of December 29th, I sent Bill away at 6 o'clock, and followed 3 hours later with light loads. Unfortunately, instead of 2 hours to the top of the pass, he took nearly 7, finding the climb, "too teepy, steep, very rough." Consequently, instead of leaving the pass at 11 a.m. for our descent into the Landsborough, we did not leave until 2 p.m. On looking over the stores on the saddle, I saw that we should be running very close to short rations, unless we had luck, for there was a distance of at least 25 miles to go down this valley, and after the return there was the Twain Valley to do. The trip down the Landsborough and back, I calculated, would take at least 8 and perhaps 10 days, but as no one had been into the valley since it was first explored some years ago by Douglas, we expected to find an unlimited supply of kakapos. It would not therefore be necessary to take much food. These birds, as stated previously, live only in districts covered with birch forests, and the whole of the country from the Landsborough to Jackson's Bay, and even further, is birch country. About 5 years before, a party, of which Mr. Muller, then Chief Surveyor of Westland, was a member, led by Douglas, made the first exploration of the Landsborough River by the north bank. During that trip the whole party of 6 had only carried a little flour and lived entirely on kakapos, which were so plentiful that Douglas says they, "had to tie the dog up, she caught too many." The river is unfordable from the moment it leaves the glacier, and hitherto no one had traversed the south bank, so I had every reason to anticipate no trouble in finding birds, for we should be the first to travel down that side. Accordingly, I decided to leave as much food as possible under the rock on the pass for our 2 days' work on the Twain River. We therefore took 7 or 8 pounds of flour, some tea, sugar, a little chocolate, cocoa, and treacle, enough to last us with luck and birds for 10 days. In fact, so certain was I that we should have no lack of birds, that I almost decided to take nothing but tea and sugar. In addition to the food we had camera, instruments, a blanket each, field books, ice axe, 8x10 fly, a small axe in case it was necessary to cut a tree for sparring a creek, the homemade light loads of about 35 pounds. The Maori no likey the climb down the snow couloir, but the rope eased his mind greatly, and when he got onto the glacier below, down which we had to go for nearly a mile, the poor old fellow was very unhappy. He pushed one foot gingerly along in front, and brought the other up to it, and so on, having grave doubts whether the ice would bear his weight. However, in a quarter of an hour he felt happier, and when he got onto the surface moraine, he likey more, and stepped out like a man, being quite convinced that he was off the glacier. I here unroped and was pushing ahead when I heard an exclamation behind me, and found that the Maori had stepped on a piece of thinly covered ice, with the usual result of sitting down with more speed than grace. On turning round to get up, he saw that he was still on ice, and with the most ludicrous expression of surprise he said, "Golly, I me tink no more ice." When we ultimately reached the lateral moraine, he was still very doubtful, and fully expected to find ice cropping up somewhere. I do not know if anyone has had a Maori on a glacier before, but imagine this was the first time that one has been on alpine rope, and, considering all the superstitions concerning the ranges that Maoris have, I consider Bill showed uncommon pluck in facing it as he did. I could see he was in a regular funk, but he showed his courage by setting his teeth, and not betraying it, except by his colour, which was yellow. Below the glacier for 2 miles, the river runs between high terraces, in a channel cut down through old morainic and other deposits, there being a large grassy plateau, 4,300 feet above sea level, on each side of and 300 feet above the river. This is covered with large erratic blocks, and is cut through by the Spence Creek at 1 mile and Le Blanc at 2 miles, which flow from the glaciers of those names between high terraces. These two glaciers are both near the river, and the streams from them are black with slaty silt, and rush down over large boulders at a great pace. Both gave us considerable trouble to ford, and the latter especially being really dangerous enough to be unpleasant, for we had to step onto large stones a foot under water, between which the stream was deep, and owing to the dirtiness of the water we could only find the next stone by feeling with the ice axe. The stream was running like a mill race, which made it the more difficult to make a sure step. Here at 3,520 feet we found the first burnable scrub, and made a rough shelter with a piece of canvas under a rock about sunset, having taken 13 hours over a journey which could have been done in 7 hours had my companion been any good in rough country. The Maori worked like a man and did his best, but owing to short-sightedness was painfully slow. It was fortunate that I had made a point of reaching a place where we could have a fire, for it rained for 2 days. But we were not at all happy, as there was only room for one of us to sit up at a time. However, Bill was "pery tiffy" stiff, so he was not sorry to lie down most of the day. The reason of this discomfort was that we could not find any poles to pitch our fly properly. Had we been in a better place for timber, we should have been happy enough. On the moraine of the Macaro I had killed a kea with a stone, but had seen no other birds, consequently our flour began to dwindle rapidly, and by the end of the second day we had little left, though limiting ourselves to a small slice of bread per meal and a stick of chocolate. On the last day of 1894, my diary states that, quote, "This is a poor game when caught in bad weather, under a stone where only one can sit upright at a time. We can neither return nor go on, everything is in flood. When limited to 2 small slices of bread a day and no birds, the fun begins. Bill and I have been talking of our first kakapo all day, and are beginning to doubt if any birds exist. Menu for the last dinner of 1894. Quote, a conversation about kakapo and wekas, dessert, a slice of bread and cup of cocoa." End quote. This shelter we named Musk Camp, because here our only firewood was mountain musk, as it is generally called. It is a scrub of the myrtle species, of a sage green colour, and grows to a height of 4 feet. The leaves, when burnt, smell very like incense, and are not unpleasant to mix with tobacco. It only grows above the 2,500 feet level, a pure alpine shrub. There is another kind, of which I have only found 2 specimens, with a large leaf and slightly different scent when burned. This I call the incense plant, and found it in the Douglas River near the Marchant Glacier. Also 1 specimen in the Waiho country. To burn a little of either shrub in a room has a delightful effect, and is much liked by those who have had it brought to them from the ranges. The former is found on both sides of the divide. January 1st, 1895 was dull, but the rain had stopped, therefore we pushed on down the valley. A few miles below Musk Camp on the northern side, a fine glacier sweeps down off Fett's Peak, right into the valley to 2,950 feet above the sea, having its terminal face for a quarter of a mile washed by the Landsborough River. About 4 miles from the camp, a very large creek from the Arthur Glacier on the dividing range descends in a series of cascades through a fine gorge, and then bursts out over great stones into the river. We arrived here at 3 p.m. and found it uncrossable, so built a shelter for the night, hoping it would be lower next morning. We dined off 1 skinny kea and a quarter of a scone each. Bill felt pery sore inside, making me pery weak, but it could not be helped. A rough day after breakfasting off a conversation concerning wekas is not easy work, and to have to finish it with only a mouthful or 2 of kea and bread is trying, to say the least of it. About sunset, we heard wekas, kiwis, and kakapos within 50 yards of us, across the river. The Landsborough has a mighty volume of water in it, and rushes down at a great pace in its rapid descent. It is unfordable from the glacier for 30 miles of its course. It spreads out onto large flats at this point, and could be forded by a horse, if such an animal could by any chance be brought to the spot. Consequently, unable to cross the river, we had to sit and listen to the birds quite close to us, and hunger in silence like Tantalus. Quote, "Egens benigne semper dapis." End quote. On the morning of the 2nd, Thanks to a hard frost in the night, the creek was 4 inches lower and enabled us to cross by jumping from boulder to boulder, most risky work, but accomplished without accident. A mile or so below camp I saw a weasel in the bush close to the river, which explained the absence of birds on this bank. Weasels have been turned out over the Haast Pass by some officious person, and have found their way all along the south bank of the valley, but so far have not been able to cross to the other side. Soon after midday we reached the first piece of flat travelling, and continued to meet with small flats, between a mile or two of rough travelling, until the evening, when we camped opposite Mount Detchen, some 8 miles from and 1,283 below the last camp. We got no birds, and were pretty well done up for want of food, having to breakfast and dine off the same conversation and a small slice of bread about 4 by 3 inches. Next day we again moved on, and travelled till 6 p.m. over extensive flats of open pakihi land in the birch forest, with short stretches of bad travelling in between, and 1 or 2 nasty creeks to cross. At 5 p.m. we found 3 wekas, and as soon as we came to a good place to camp, in about an hour, we kindled a fire and had the 3 birds roasting on 3 sticks, and with 3 hot stones inside them. In half an hour they were standing up in the ground in front of us, while we cut, sliced, and devoured them. In another half hour 3 sticks were all that remained, Jack, the Maori, and myself having given a very good account of ourselves. A weka is equal to a common or garden fowl, so 3 birds between 2 men is a fair meal. I had very little to guide me as to the whereabouts of the pass I was to report on, and did not know where it could be on this side of the range, but from instructions received before starting up the Karangarua, I imagined that it would be near this camp. However, Bill's boots were quite worn out, and even had we plenty of stores, it would be folly, if not cruelty, to make him attempt a return journey in such footgear. I therefore decided to push on down the river next day. About 15 miles below here, the Haast River joins the Landsborough River, flowing from the Haast Pass, 1,800 feet, over which a transinsular horse track has been formed for some years from the west coast to Otago. On the beach at the mouth of the river, 25 miles from the junction of the Haast, is a store, and the same distance up the valley track from the junction would take us to Stewart's sheep station in Otago. Mr. Stewart had been the first to cross the pass, on which Sir Julius von Haast afterwards placed his own name, in the early 60s, and put cattle on the very extensive flats which are found at the junction of the 2 rivers, 300 feet. To reach these flats and the track which skirts them involved 15 miles of rough travelling, interspersed with long stretches of level going. I decided to go on as far as this track, and then either to go over to Stewart's station or down to the store on the beach, in order to get Bill a pair of boots. I had heard, however, that part of the track was to be repaired during the summer, and was in hopes that we should find a road party at work, who could perhaps satisfy our wants, and save the extra 25 miles. I intended to go alone, but Bill did not care about being left in these solitudes, so we both set out on the following morning, leaving everything in our shelter. The travelling seemed easy, unburdened as we were, but a climb of 1,100 feet over a bluff was trying to us after our long fast. This is a good illustration of the trouble caused by bluffs on the rivers, where a spur descends toward the stream and ends abruptly in a cliff, at the foot of which the river flows deep and swift. After ascending and descending 1,100 feet through bush, we emerged 500 or 600 yards only from the point at which the climb commenced, or 2 hours' work, and little over a quarter of a mile gained. It was dark before we reached the great flats at the junction of the 2 branches, but we managed to find an old hut near the track, the remains of one of Stewart's mustering whares, in which to pass the night. At 8 o'clock next morning we were wakened by a blast of dynamite about 2 miles away, and knew that for the present our spell of short commons was over, for a road party was at work on the track. Leaving Bill to follow, I hurried across the wide flats and riverbed, forded the Haast stream, and in an hour was near the road camp. Here I met one of the men, and he would not believe that I had come down the Landsborough, terra incognita to them, but thought I had come over the pass from Otago. However, he soon saw something was wrong when he took me along to his tent and saw me sampling a cold stew, for I could not wait until he had cooked a meal. When I explained that the two of us had travelled 40 miles down the river and had only 2 kias, 3 wekas, and a little flour between us in 8 days, he said that accounted for my eating a, quote, cold, greasy old stew, end quote. It also accounted for a good hot meal, which he had ready for me when the stew was finished. I knew Mr. Nightingale, the overseer, so went on and found him, but he did not know me at first in my rags, and with 4 months' growth of hair and beard, nor did I recognise myself when he gave me a looking-glass. The Maori turned up in due course and ate 12 large cold doughboys, suet dumplings, while waiting for something to be cooked, and like me, he, quote, feel very gland, quite full, end quote. We spent 4 days in this hospitable camp, and were fed up like 2 turkeys being prepared for Christmas. It will perhaps be remembered that Bill brought me some old newspapers when he rejoined me at Christmas camp, after having taken word down to Scott's about Douglas. Consequently, as there were then rumours of complications in Europe resulting from the Tsar's death, I was anxious to know whether I belonged to England or Russia. The men at this camp, being on the track, were able to get a mail every fortnight, so they were only 2 weeks behind in their news, and had papers of more than a month later date than those the Maori had brought me. During our first evening, sitting round the campfire, I asked what the news there was, and was told by one man that Jackson and Corbett, or some such names, had decided not to fight. So I said, "Is there no other news?" and was informed that there had been no news for months. However, on looking at the papers, I found them full of the mail reports of the Tsar's death, not short cable messages, and reassuring cables that the general peace was not likely to be broken. This had apparently not been worthy to be called news, as compared with a possible prize fight. This, however, is the same all the world over, for I recollect, when quite a small boy, going to England via San Francisco in 1878, the last news from Europe as we left Auckland said that, quote, war inevitable between England and Russia, end quote. On arriving at Honolulu then, the only port of call, a Russian man-of-war lay near the entrance of the harbour, and my parents were most anxious to have the latest news. When the pilot came on board, there was such a rush that my father could not get near to him, so waiting until he got an opportunity, he said to one of the passengers, "Well, what news?" To which the passenger replied, "Confound it, his name begins with a P." The rush had not been to ascertain whether war was declared, or whether the man-of-war was going to cut off the mails, but only to settle a sweepstake on the pilot's name. It was most amusing to see Jack's behaviour here. When we arrived, he was as well behaved as possible, and did not attempt to steal, but he was only waiting to find out which camp we were going to patronise. As soon as we had established ourselves in Mr. Nightingale's camp, he began to thieve right and left from the other tents. It is owing to this failing that he lost his leg some months previously. Bill caught us plenty of eels and wekas, which were plentiful here, and prevented the double strain of our presence from affecting the stores of our hosts to any extent before the packer came up from the beach with more provisions. The Maori's boots were quite worn out by the time he reached Nightingale's camp, and we had a good deal of trouble to get another pair. The packer arrived in due course, and returned to the beach for a few stores for us, but could get no boots, so Bill had to content himself with 2 old odd ones belonging to some of the men. Having got these, we started on our return trip up the river on January 11th, with a few pounds of rice and flour. The Maori took 2 days over the journey, as I wanted him to catch some birds on one of the lower flats, but I pushed on and reached camp the same evening, doing 15 miles in 11 hours, which is pretty fast going. The camp was 1,003 feet above sea level and 750 above the junction of the Haast. In 1890, Messrs. T.N. Brodrick and Sladden crossed from Lake Ohau in Canterbury over a low saddle of 4,300 feet, and descending to the Landsborough River, stayed a night in the valley and returned to the Canterbury side of the range. As already stated, I did not quite know where to look for this saddle, but on going up the river to the camp, I crossed 3 open grassy flats absolutely alive with rabbits, and then a 4th and 5th without any of these vermin. The small flat on which we were camping was the 6th, and this had literally thousands of rabbits, the ground being as bare as a barrack yard. When we reached this open space and came out of the trees onto the grass, it seemed as if the whole surface of the ground turned a somersault in sections, in such countless numbers were the rabbits diving into their burrows. The ground looked honeycombed. The fact that there were 2 grassy flats free of bunnies between this point and number 3 flat showed that they had not come up the river. Therefore, they must have come from the eastern side of the range via some low pass, probably Brodrick's. Having left the pea rifle at Christmas camp, and owing to the extreme shyness of the rabbits, we could not have got any had we wanted them, and the 3 wekas caught on our arrival here on the way down had saved us the trouble of a possibly useless hunt. There were none on the smaller flats above this point. The next day was too foggy to attempt an examination of the high country, so I hunted wekas and snared 2 or 3, while the Maori, who arrived in the afternoon, brought 4 kakapos and 2 wekas, a heavy load. The 13th was a wet day, but we got 9 more wekas a little farther down the river, and spent the 14th, which was again wet, in smoking them for future use. Having lost our salt, we had to depend on smoke. We now had enough birds to last us till we reached the stores on the pass. The 15th I spent in ascending Brodrick's saddle, which, as I anticipated, was above the camp, and the rabbits must have come over by that route. I also looked at another low pass more to the east, but neither was of much use for a road, being too precipitous. The view into Canterbury was very extensive, and I gloated over the grand open grassy hills for some time before descending again to the terrible west coast scrub and forest. There was, however, no reason to complain of the bush in the Landsborough valley, because like all other country covered with birch forest, it is fairly easy to travel in. The bush is fairly open, with fine timber, clean-limbed trees of 5 and 6 feet in diameter, and little undergrowth, and when the grass line is reached at 3,500 feet, there is none of the usual mountain scrub. The trees merely become smaller until they cease. From near Brodrick's Pass I took several photographs, which were unfortunately spoiled by damp, like so many others this year. I had to leave the boxes of exposed plates sometimes for weeks, under a stone or other shelter, to be picked up on our final return to habitation, and the damp marked them rather badly. A grand view of the Hooker Range was to be seen from this spur. Mount Hooker, 8,644 feet, across the valley with its great horn of rock rising out of fine ice fields, looked as if it would give some trouble to ascend. The pure white ice dome of Detchen, 8,500 feet, some 10 miles up the river, has a snow line of under 5,000 feet, and except for innumerable bergschrunds, would make an easy climb. Detchen is, I think, one of the most beautiful snow domes or cones I have seen. It rises at a gentle angle which gradually becomes steeper at the top, and in its perfect symmetry almost reminded one of the volcanic cone of Taranaki, 8,260 feet, in the North Island, though the actual cone only began at 4,000 feet. Beyond Detchen, the rocky pinnacles of Strachan, 8,359 feet, rose out of sundry fine secondary glaciers, and a little further away Fett's Peak, 8,092 feet, showed his fine rock peak, an equally hard nut to crack as his neighbour from a climbing point of view. Miles away to the northeast I picked up the Footstool, Sefton and Dwarf, which lie at the head of this and the Karangarua River. 4,000 feet below, the valley could be followed for 20 miles, the first few miles having a broad flat bottom with many large pakihis or grass flats, through which the river twisted here and there, flowing close against the base of a spur, dividing the different flats. Gradually, however, as the eye wandered up, the valley became narrower, till at last no flat places appeared, but each spur descended right into the river and formed difficult and rough travelling. On the immediate right hand, Mount Mackenzie, over 8,000 feet, raised his rocky summit, with hardly a vestige of snow or ice, a miniature Matterhorn, which, with his shattered rocks, would be a troublesome fellow to climb on this side. At 3 p.m. a storm of rain wetted me to the skin, and compelled me to descend to camp. On the way down, Jack caught me 2 kakapos, but the climbing being beyond his powers by the route I took, he went home by the line we ascended, so no further birds could be found. On the 16th we went up to our 3rd camp on the down journey, and had reached a point halfway to Arthur Creek the next day when more rain compelled us to camp. Here I made another ascent on the 18th, but beyond obtaining some observations and photographs, there was little worth mentioning. We had 2 empty treacle tins, which we brought in case of necessity, and these we filled with the oil of the kakapo. This liquid is of a light straw colour, and though not as good as weka oil, is very nourishing. As I knew we should find ourselves short of flour till we reached the rat trap on our return down the Karangarua, I saved all the oil I could to mix with the flour. It is a good, though not very palatable way to economise. The Maori was very happy now, for we had unlimited food, having not yet finished the smoked wekas, and because I got 1 or sometimes 2 kakapo on each ascent. They seemed to have been all above the bush line at this time of year, which accounted to some extent for our bad luck on the way down the river. One evening, sitting over the fire, Bill mentioned a man whom he had seen at the road camp, and said, "He never poor." "Never poor?" I replied. "What do you mean?" "He always fat, never poor." "Course he's always fat, you old fool," I said. "When once a man is fat, he generally remains so." "De Maori," said Bill, "he sometimes poor, sometimes fat. He no tucker, he pery poor, but belly full, he pery fat, same as de hen." He meant by this that a Maori gets in good and bad condition in the same way as a weka does, according to his food. I laughed at the notion at the moment, but on looking at my companion next day, I saw that his dusky old face was now shining like a copper kettle, and he looked like a well-groomed horse. In a ragged cover, certainly, but still well-groomed. A fortnight previously, he cut a sorrowful figure, and looked in wretchedly poor condition after the short spell of starvation. I have since been told that the change is quite noticeable amongst Maoris, according to their food. The 19th was cold and wet. The snow was quite low down, but we pushed on in order to cross Arthur Creek before a warm wind came and caused it to flood, and getting over far more easily than before, we made a rough shelter opposite Fett's Glacier in a storm of sleet and rain. On the following morning there was little improvement, and we travelled on and crossed the LeBlanc stream, also very low, owing to the cold, and bivouacked out on the grassy plateau, 3,993 feet, about 1.5 miles below the McKerrow Glacier, reaching there about 5 o'clock. The day had cleared during the afternoon, and the peaks began to show, as the clouds slowly disappeared, and by sunset they were all visible, looking glorious in their coating of fresh snow. This was a wild-looking sight for a bivouac, a great grassy basin of 2 miles by 1, with great erratic blocks scattered over it, surrounded on 3 sides by towering rock and ice-capped peaks, down which avalanches would thunder every half hour, making poor Bill start and look nervously round over his shoulder, for he never got over his fear of the avalanche thunder. While from a hillock behind we could see miles down the gradually darkening valley of the Landsborough, in descending which, 3 weeks before, we had had such a bad time. As the darkness closed in, we gathered some stunted vegetation, which grew in tufts here and there, a few inches high, and coaxed the billy until it boiled, and sitting down, watched the last 3 of the smoked wekas being cooked. They had to be all cooked that evening, as Bill informed me. They were a bit long, i.e. high, but they were none the worse for that, luckily, as we always had good appetites. As usual, when we trusted to the weather being fine, and put up no shelter, it began to rain as soon as we had rolled into our blankets, and with equal cussedness, no sooner had we put the fly up on a rope between the ice axes than it stopped again, and the stars shone out. The Maori explained this by saying, "He come, he see over de hill, he say, 'Golly, 2 men no camp.' He lane. He see again, he say, 'Dem fell have camp.' He stop." We were therefore able to use the canvas as an extra blanket after all. Bill's boots were again nearly done for, so instead of going directly into the Twain River, we returned on the 21st over the Karangarua Pass to Christmas Flat, taking some of the stores from the depot on the saddle. It was hardly worthwhile spending 3 or 4 days in going down to Castle's Flat for more stores, though we only had bare provision for a week left. It may have been foolish to risk another starve in the Twain Valley, but I venture to say that most persons would have acted as I did and risked it, instead of going down and up that awful river again. This is one of the occasions on which I cursed my fate at having to do such hard work with only 1 man, and I am afraid I sometimes wished those who were responsible could have had a few of our experiences before refusing us a 3rd member of our party. However, the Twain was still in front of us, so we could not afford to waste time. Accordingly, we only spent a day and a half at Christmas Flat, to allow Bill to make himself some Maori sandals, or parara, out of flax. These do not last long, but are capital footgear for ordinary riverbed or other travelling, 1 pair a day being about the average. On sharp stones, however, as will be seen, they are soon cut to pieces, and 3 pairs will only do a day's work. Bill was convinced that 3 pairs would be sufficient for the Twain River, so he made 5 and left 2 at the camp when we started on the following day. I spent my day off in washing and generally mending my rags, which hardly resembled clothes, and making a few extra observations in order that no time need be wasted when we came back out of the Twain River. The geology of this district forms an interesting study, and I greatly regretted my ignorance on that subject. Of course, we brought in hand specimens every day, which we looked upon with little favour when they increased to several pounds in weight, for though a 50-pound load weighs 50 pounds, I am sure it is heavier if there are 20 pounds of stones in place of 20 pounds of food. These specimens, which have been collected for years by Douglas, and during the last 2 years by me, are from every valley and almost every range of the Southern Alps, on the western slopes from the Waiho River to Jackson's Bay. They are all in the Hokitika Survey Office, labelled and classified according to their locality, with the dip and strike of the rocks noted on each one. A most valuable collection, which should enable a geologist to do good work. When these will be made use of, I do not know, but only hope they will not die the death of most things which find their way into a public office. Generally speaking, the main dividing range of the Southern Alps is composed of a reddish sandstone and a great deal of slate. In fact, the prevailing rock is slate at most of the places I have crossed. The outer ranges are schist and gneiss. The junction of the 2 formations is generally near the divide. In the district at the south of Mount Sefton, however, the slate formation appears to extend from the Dwarf across to the Hooker Range, and to continue along it for some 20 miles, where it again crosses onto the dividing range. The latter seems to be of schist formation from the Dwarf to near Broderick's Pass, and then again runs into the slate formation. The Landsborough River, down to this point, follows the junction of the 2 formations, the valley having schist on the east and slate on the west side. About Broderick's Pass, the river, however, leaves the schist formation and has cut through the slate and, sweeping round, has found its way to the sea on the west coast. This would lead one to suppose that the Hooker Range is the original dividing range, and that the water of the ancient glacier found its way eastwards. Of course, it requires a geologist to decide this point, and many other interesting points, but at present no geologist has been into the West Coast ranges. A great deal that has been written on the subject is pure guesswork, and in some cases quite incorrect. End of chapter 14.